Hi there, I'm Rob from ReelyReviews, and today I'm going it alone again. I'm going to be reviewing a movie that I watched yesterday, Gone Girl, starring Ben Affleck and Rosamund Pike, directed by David Fincher. There was a lot of hype surrounding this particular film. I haven't read the novel before any of you ask. I've heard, altering things about whether the book matches up to the film or vice versa. But I'm viewing it solely from a filmmaking perspective here, that means, really. I've studied film for 3 years at the University of Kent. I got a first, so I'm used to sort of overanalyzing films a bit, and this film, I think the first thing I'm going to say about it is that I think it was great. It was really great, and I'd recommend it to any of you out there who haven't seen it yet. Wasn't expecting much, I heard loads of good things about it and everything, but I was still quite apprehensive going into it. I think it was, the fact that, David Fincher directed it didn't put me off, because he's one of my favourite directors of all time for good reason. He did my favourite film ever made, Fight Club. He did the movie Seven, which me and Matt previously reviewed on this channel, which, by the way, I'm going to get into a bit later on in this review. And so generally I wasn't really too preoccupied with the fact that he was directing it. I think it was more Ben Affleck, to be honest. The last film I saw of his before this was actually probably Pearl Harbor or Daredevil. That was his sort of... if Ben Affleck has really kind of revitalized his career to an extent. He directed the movie Gone Baby Gone, which starred his brother, won an Oscar for it, I believe. He did Argo, of course. That got massive critical acclaim, and he starred in it, of course, as well. He's not a bad actor, honestly. In this particular film, he's very good. In fact, the whole cast are. So anyway, I better get into the gist of it. What I will say in this review is that there will be spoilers. So if you don't want to hear me talk about the movie in depth, then stop watching this review, go and see it first. So, Gone Girl. The plot, basically, Ben Affleck plays a guy called Nick, who is married to Amy, played by Rosamund Pike, and they are both creative writers who are very successful, have a lot of money. And basically, they move from New York to Missouri. The narrative, first thing I'll say about the narrative is that it does, right off the bat, it kind of leads you on a certain tangent, and that's kind of Fincher's clever way of playing with narrative techniques. And I felt that there was a particular Rashomon sort of vibe about this film. If you're wondering why I'm looking away from the camera, by the way, I'm actually looking at my notes that I made on this film. There is a massive Rashomon kind of narrative about it, which basically means it's playing with unreliable narration. I heard the book does that better than the film, but and the embedded first-person sort of narration is given through the form of Amy's diary. So she is kind of leading the audience along in her point of view, her perspective. And perspective, I think, is a very, very important theme in this film. And it's one of the reasons why I like this film so much, really. It's sort of... it plays with it to such an extent that it's classic Fincher, kind of narrative. Then, basically, after living there for a bit, and their marriage apparently is on shaky ground, she goes missing. She disappears one day, and Ben Affleck sees the evidence of a struggle when he gets back to his house, and the police come in, and next thing you know, there's a media outburst about the whole affair. Honestly, this film is so good with its social commentary about the media's manipulation. It's a theme which Fincher has explored through a majority of his other movies. I think Fight Club, Seven. I've noticed we actually do a lot of Fincher films. I'm not sure what Matt's feeling about Fincher is. I think he likes him as well, but for some reason we're on a bit of a Fincher angle at the moment. We'll see if we can maybe keep that up, turn it into a thing. I don't know. Anyway, I digress. So in Gone Girl, it's about the media's oversaturation of the story to an extent to the rest of America. The fact that the news doesn't know the whole truth about certain situations. There's over-presumption about Nick's motives. I should explain at this point that Nick is immediately suspect number one, even though he firmly and vehemently claims his innocence. Again, we not sure whether to trust him at this point. He actually, about midway through the film, maybe, I don't know, 30 minutes in, well, not midway through the film, about half to midway through the film, we see he's having an affair with one of his students. So, of course, it plays with empathy quite a lot in this film. There's you can kind of pick to an extent which character you're more empathetic towards. I'm personally more empathetic towards Nick. He may have had like an extramarital affair, and I should explain as well. Amy actually is not dead, and she goes on the run. She's tired of being utilised and abused by, neglected, I think is the better word. Because Nick doesn't seem to be a great husband to her. He's quite lazy. He doesn't really care about... He cares... The reason they moved to Missouri was because his mum was sick. So you get the impression he cares more about his mum than her. And all this pressure is kind of balling up with Amy. There's a particularly potent line which she writes in her diary near the beginning of the film. This was after Ben Affleck tells his sister, Margot, that it's their anniversary coming up. And there's an analepsis towards this scene where she's writing in her diary, and there's the first person narration. And she's written a book called Amazing Amy, which is a massive success. And this kind of haunts her, really, in the film. Because she says in the diary, Amazing fucking Amy is getting fucking married, or something along those lines. And you get the impression, in that sense, the character is actually getting married, and not her. Her creation overwhelms her own contributions to society, in a sense. So you kind of feel a bit of empathy for her to that extent. But actually, this all balls up to the point where Nick's not listening to her, he's being quite neglectful, so she leaves and tries to frame him for her murder. Now this, and she's not actually genuinely missing. She leaves of her own accord, and she stays in this trailer trash park with a bunch of hicks who of course rob her, which got a great deal of satisfaction from me in particular, because I want to see her get her comeuppance, because I was generally more empathetic towards Nick in the movie. I mean, I'm not saying I wasn't empathetic totally with Amy, but how sadistic she was. This character really... She's evil, really, in all honesty. And it was good to see her get her comeuppance. And with Nick, he may have had an extramarital affair, but Amy takes it too far to get him back, you know. At the end, you kind of get the impression that she's really manipulative of him, and she probably doesn't really love him. But, of course, Nick kind of has no choice, really. And in the end, of course, she's always one step ahead of him. they basically, the majority of the movie is Nick trying to clear his name and to also try to expose Amy's lies, and it doesn't happen. It's a classic Fincher scenario where the bad guy, or in this case girl, wins. She actually manages to impregnate herself with Nick's, Nick's thoughts, and so she's backed him into a corner basically because she utilises. The great thing about this film is as I said before, it's the media's she utilises and manipulates the media's oversaturation of the story to the rest of America, and creates a sort of web of deceit about Nick's motives, utilising to a great extent about like the American media, and sex and gender I think plays a massive role in this film to establish the themes and social commentary. The lead anchor on this news network that we always see in the background, like every time we see a TV in this film, it's about the news about Amy's disappearance, and I think that's great social commentary on the part of Fincher, relating to how the media oversaturates everything with certain stories and doesn't take the full kind of story into account, in a sense. So the lead police officer, the news anchor in this report is always a woman who's constantly castigating Nick for the things he does, and it's always seemingly, apart from Tyler Perry's character, the defense attorney, she's more than likely interviewing a woman about the situation. The lead police officer in charge of Nick and Amy's case is also a woman, a female. And you get the impression that the writer of Gone Girl deliberately... hold on, I'm just gonna look up who wrote the novel. I probably should have prepped for this more, I do apologise, but I've actually got a long shift tomorrow, so I'm kind of rushing again, Gillian Flynn, that's it. I guess the fact that the writer of the novel is a female as well, and she also, I believe, had a hand in the screenplay for this film. There's lots of sort of feminist ethics kind of going on here. I could be wrong, but that's kind of my interpretation of it. And, the false sympathy and saccharine insincerity that this newscaster gives about Amy's disappearance. It's frighteningly true to life. You know what I mean? So, like I said, Amy's going all across the country to avoid getting found out by Nick. Nick and Margot hire a defense attorney played by Tyler Perry. Again, bit of apprehension there given his track record with movies. Not great, really. But he was great in this film. I thought he added a bit of he added a bit of comedy to it, and it was a very darkly comedic film in a lot of instances, just because of the situations that all the characters find themselves in, you can't help but laugh nervously at what's going to happen sometimes. And there's one particular line which got a big laugh where, I should explain the context of this first. Amy leaves clues to her fate, shall we say, to the police and to Nick, because of course Nick at this point is unaware that his wife is lying, and she's actually not. She's disappeared of her own accord and everything, which leads them to a woodshed filled with stuff, filled with just junk that Amy's bought using Nick's name, and so therefore implicates him totally in her disappearance. And later on, this plays a part in when Nick is trying to clear his name on TV, and he's trying to get one over on Amy by making himself sort of sympathetic in the same way, in the same vein of a kind of media sympathy for a sort of bad guy by, you know, it's the certain inflections in the words and everything, and it's really cleverly written. You know, this film, I think. He says a line about, I can't remember the exact line, but it was, you had me up. It was something along the lines of, you had me up against the woodshed, and of course, Amy is watching this, saving the house with her ex-spouse lover, played by Neil Patrick Harris, who's really crazy, by the way, in this film. He's a complete lunatic. And of course he's obsessed over her, he stalks her, and, you know, get the impression he plays a part in Amy's ultimate motives, and, you know, the vitriolic stuff that she has towards men. But anyway, she's watching it around his house, and we see her kind of going, you know, in that sort of sense. But actually, I think it's more beneficial to her, because then she thinks, she kind of formulates this plot in her head that Nick is, you know, oh, actually Nick is not too bad after all. But she uses that to her advantage. She comes home, she murders Neil Patrick Harris in cold blood during sex, with one of the more graphic scenes in this film. Film very, very graphic, by the way. Lots of violence, lots of sex. Do not take the kiddies to see this one. And she comes home in a car covered in blood, and just falls into Nick's arms, and Nick is like, "You fucking bitch," you know. Yeah, because he is totally. She's always one step ahead of him throughout the whole film. The protagonist and antagonist in this film are both creative writers. Very meta, sort of a kind of self-reflexive aspect about this film that kind of goes on here. And there's even a line, one line about where Margot says to Nick, "Oh, how that's so meta," you know, instant self-reflexivity right there. And she also says, as they're going deeper into the narrative and they're uncovering all this stuff, she says, "I thought writers hated cliches." That line, I think, totally fits in the narrative. And if that line was in the book, it sort of takes on a new life in film format, really. You know, about screenplay writers. I mean, adapting a film from a book, I think, it's always going to be challenging, because you can't include everything just because of the limitations and parameters of what a film can and can't convey. You know, there are certain things in a book that just will be impossible to actually convey on the big screen. You know, it could be done in some format, but it will be intensely difficult, and, you know, lend films adaptations of some books are more artistic. That's why a lot of films adapted from books, I think, are very artistic and lots of visual imagery going on. But yeah, so lots of kind of self-reflexive moments in the film, lots of very funny moments in the film. But at the same time, this is a pure, you know, thriller type. You know, it's you really root for Nick, to be honest, in this film, because he's just such in such a precarious position, you know. But anyway, I'm gonna press on now, and say, well, first off, I want to talk about the music before I go into the big ending sequence that I have planned for this video. Fincher, apparently, Trent Reznor of Nine Inch Nails fame does the soundtrack along with Atticus Ross, and the music, yeah, it has a very eerie kind of sparse, dense kind of feel, which is, you know, ambient kind of feel, which is very effective given the themes and sometimes the mise en scène that happens in this film, the locations, and, you know, the disparity of the situation. And he apparently told Trent Reznor to make the musical equivalent, David Fincher told Trent Reznor, to make the musical equivalent of an insincere facade, which again, would tie in and explain some of the themes associated with the media coverage and about their sort of false sympathy and saccharine insincerity as they convey all their reports. Like even the reporter lady or the news anchor lady who interviews Nick, she still goes through her protocol of say, would you look into that camera and make sure you smile and, you know, be all show busy about the whole thing. And it really, you know, given how intense the situation is, the fact that everyone, all the news anchors, they want it to be some like big bloody parade, big sort of, you know, kind of be Hollywoody, you know. I think that's a good, a clever idea on the writer's part and Fincher's part to include them. Last thing we're going to say, female police officer. Obviously, the male police officer she has with her most of the time, he is intensely convinced of Nick's involvement in the scenario. And you get the impression a lot of the men in this film are idiots. You know, like when Amy comes back to Nick, they're interviewing her, and Ben Affleck, Nick is like, oh yeah, she's, you know, manipulative and she's scheming. Can't you see what's happening? And then the policeman just goes, why can't you just be happy that your wife is back? You know, it's just so ridiculous. It's like he's one of my favourite characters in the film just because of how, like, you know, he's not like a sort of Hollywood police kind of guy who's just out for justice and meant to do the right thing. You get the impression. He's just sort of, he's just, I can't really explain it, but he's funny as hell, really. I don't know who plays him. I believe he's been in a few other films. You'll have to look him up, but I like his performance, really. Finally, the female police officer is suspicious of Amy when she returns. The head male police chief who's conducting the investigation is overly concerned about Amy and promptly cuts the female police officer when she tries to like butt in with questions. Like, you know, oh, what about the Punch and Judy puppet? Oh, what about so-and-so? And he's like, yeah, I think we've had enough of this, thank you. It's like, the way women are treated in certain circles, you don't sometimes believe them, you sometimes believe them to only be the victims, you know, and, you know, I think what Fincher and the writer are showing in this film, I hope I'm right, otherwise I'll get really castigated about this thing, is that they can actually be manipulative and create scenarios for themselves to, you know, that's what Amy is essentially doing. She's exploiting the fact that the way the media treat women in this diegesis and, you know, relating back to the real world. You know, a lot of this film is very close to home in a certain aspects of the media's portrayal of things. Like I keep saying, it's just it's you know, you feel like the males are always the instigators and the females are always the victims. So I mean, you know, I could go on and on about the social commentary aspects in this. There's so much to gain from this. It's like Fight Club, where every time I watch it, I spot something new, a new metaphor hiding behind the surface of the film. That's what I'd say. You shouldn't really go into this film expecting something. I mean, it was, you know, the narrative was quite easy to follow, but you probably shouldn't go into this film with hoping for a conventional sort of narrative, because it really isn't. It really isn't a conventional narrative, and that's one of the things I think that draws me to this film immensely. Okay, right, we're approaching half an hour of recording. I know, this is going to take ages to upload. But I've got to say, after I came out, I made so many comparisons with Fincher's previous movie and a film that me and Matt have already reviewed, Seven. And, I mean, where do you start? You've got the same director, you got the same score, Trent Reznor, his version of Closer, a remix version of Closer, I should say, at the beginning of Seven. and of course him and Atticus Ross do the main soundtrack to this film. He enjoys working with Trent Reznor, it seems. He worked with him on A Girl with a Dragon Tattoo as well, and it really fits in with his style, I think, Fincher. Fincher really goes for that really dark, kind of hopeless narrative, and, you know, Reznor's music, you know, you think, oh, this is the guy who was in Nine Inch Nails. Their music seems pretty hopeless and bleak at times. Anyway, I can't dwindle too on that. But, you know, it works, and I think they should keep collaborating, because as far as I'm concerned, it works. The fact that she comes back and she turns herself in a sense, covered in blood, to Nick at the end, and we think, oh, they're going to find her and they're going to capture her. This is exactly the situation in Seven, where they think, oh, we're going to capture this guy, we're going to make him suffer. No, he just turns up on the police station's doorstep, virtually. I know we didn't give it... I don't think we gave any spoilers for Seven. So, I apologise if I am spoiling that film for you. But, like I said, you know, you probably shouldn't have watched it anyway if you were expecting spoilers. Even not just about this film. He comes in and he turns himself in and he's covered in blood because he's ripped all his fingerprints off of his hands. It's so... You know, Amy in this film, I think, is the female equivalent of John Doe. So manipulative and so always one step ahead of the game. You know, the fact that she leaves Nick and Margot and the rest of the people on that side clues, the anniversary notes. Same thing, essentially, with John Doe leaving the murder victims as clues to his ulterior motive. I've got to say, you know, Rosamund Pike, she was fantastic. You know, she... brilliant, you know, portrayal, and so sadistic, and you really wanted her to get her comeuppance, you know, in a very... And she was very convincing, you know, perhaps too convincing, you know, perhaps frighteningly too convincing. But there's also very similar motives revolving around social commentary and perceptions of people and the media, and like when John Doe, for instance, is in the back of the car and Morgan Freeman and Brad Pitt and him are driving towards the desert, where his next clue is, and they're talking about Brad Pitt saying, "Oh, you murdered all those innocent people," and John Doe, Kevin Spacey, says, "What innocent? What, a guy who eats himself virtually to death? A woman who's so vain about her appearance she has to cover herself up?" You know, things like that. There's similar motives, I think, between the two, relating around social commentary and the perceptions of the individual person and the status quo in our society. So, I mean, this is particularly important when she comes back and she basically says to Nick is in a frenzy about the whole thing. He's going, "Oh, you're so manipulative and you're doing all this and this, and we did nothing but fight and argue when we were married." And she just simply says, "Well, that's marriage." And that got a massive laugh from the audience in the cinema that I was watching it. Because you think, yeah, actually, she's got a point. You know, both of these villains, you don't want to empathise with them, but you can't help but empathising them to an extent, you know, regarding their motives. And she's basically just taking that motive and going to the, you know, about marriage and involving fighting and arguing, just taking it to the absolute extreme, you know. Like John Doe is taking it to the extreme in his sort of cleansing, if you like, of the American population of all the 7 deadly sins. The fact that in both films the bad guy, or bad girl in this case, wins through being so manipulative and so one step of the game, and crafty, and essentially leading both antagonists, Amy and John Doe, lead the protagonists in the respective films into a trap. You know, Nick, he's no choice but to live with her at the end. He's no choice but he can't report her because the media is so blown up with this idea that Amy's America's sweetheart at this point. He just will get in more deep shit than he already is, you know. And in another sort of sense, with Seven, he kind of leads Brad Pitt to kill him playing on his emotions. You know, there's a lot of playing on their emotions and manipulating between both the antagonists. He leads him to kill him because of the whole. He put his wife's head in a box, and he realizes that with wrath, which is the last of the sins, the only way he can achieve that is if Brad Pitt kills him, and then he wins. Basically, he's completed his mission to accomplish all the 7 deadly sins. And finally, just with the 7 similarities, and as you can see, I've laid out quite a groundwork for a lot of them, leads me to believe that Fincher takes on adapting. The main reasons why he took on adapting Gone Girl, in my opinion, because the themes were so similar to 7. And he is definitely a director who can just work with those themes and just run with it to such an extent and be so good at just conveying and emphasising all the social commentary and socio-political aspects that relate to everyday life in this film. So yeah, great film. I still don't think I've talked too much about it, but we have just gone past half an hour, and I'm fearing that I'll go on for too long and you just will get bored immediately. But watch Gone Girl. It's one of the films of the year, in my opinion. Great director, great soundtrack, great acting. And this is my final word on it. I will say, out of 5... I'm trying to think of a rating system here. I would say out of 5 blunt hammer shots to the head, I would give it 4.5. And this is Rob Verriard, and that was my review on Gone Girl. See you next time.